Right, now, later on today, Grant Shapps will face questions from the Defence Committee over funding for the armed forces.
Well, the hearing comes as the Defence Secretary delivered warnings that the UK is moving from a post-war to a pre-war world amid rising threats from Russia and China. Well, to tell us more on this is military analyst Sean Bell, who believes we should absolutely spend more on defence, adding that it's essential for our protection. Meanwhile, former NATO commander Chris Parry reckons that we currently invest enough and it's an allocation issue instead. Sean, let's start with you. Why do we need more money for our military? Good morning.
Good morning, Jeremy. Good morning, Nicola. I'm not so sure it's about more money. I think it's about, at the end of the Cold War, we were spending 4% on defence. Peace dividend, we now spend 2% on defence. And yet it starts to feel like a rather more dangerous world. Grant Shapps is saying it's more dangerous. One of the things that we have in the next 10 years particularly is we're replacing a lot of our nuclear capability. That capital spend, 41 billion, is coming out the defence budget as well. That'll leave fewer pounds available to spend on defence. And the third point is that the way of war by the West, we tend to use technology, precision strike, because we don't like to just throw bodies at the fight the way the Russians do. And the danger is that high-tech precision fighting costs money. We need to invest in it. We've been shown to have very limited war stocks. And therefore, given that defence is an insurance policy against an uncertain world, it feels like 2% doesn't feel like enough given the challenges around us at the moment.
Sean, completely agree. Parry, come on, my lad, I agree with everything you usually say. You've been going on for months at me about this axis of Russia and China and Iran and how the world has changed. 2.6% we need. I know there's a cost of living crisis, but the world has changed. We've talked about cyber security. We need to up our game, don't we, Chris, on a serious note?
Yeah, we do, Jeremy. But if you give the Ministry of Defence money now, they'll waste it. Sean knows as well as I do that if you want to build our defence forces up to what they need to be, it needs to be a 5 to 10 year transformation. If I gave you 10 million tomorrow for producing additional artillery shells, for example, we simply can't do it because our industry isn't geared up for it. So rather like giving somebody a pint, if you like, having been sort of thirsty in the desert for a week, you'll kill him. It's the same with the Ministry of Defence. The fact of life is, in accordance with the integrated review of 2019, we've got enough money. It's just badly allocated right now. What we do need to have is a 5-10 year plan which is properly costed, which says, look, at some stage we're going to have to take on Russia and China. If that's the case, this is what it costs. And one thing we've been very clear about, you, Rosie, and me, and that is the fact, that if you don't deter enough, you're going to find yourself fighting. Right now, if I'm on the other side, I'm thinking, you know what? I can see the bottom of their locker. I might take them on sometime soon.
Sean, just taking that point up from Chris, and I'm really interested in this debate, and I mean this, enough money badly allocated, he says. Your response to that?
Well, there's a lot that Chris and I will agree on. Having worked in the Ministry of Defence, there are successive reviews that suggest that the money could be better spent. I have no doubt that is true. I also think that if you look at just over 2% of GDP on defence spending, only 11 of the 32 NATO countries do that. I think we should be putting more pressure on the other 21 to step up to the plate, given that NATO is part of our security umbrella. Challenge, though, I think, is ultimately you get what bang for your buck do you get. I agree with Chris that we need to be smarter how we spend it, but I do, and also I'm a taxpayer like you in this country, and we've got lots of difficult priorities. I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that we should suddenly double the defence spending, but Grant Shapps, our Defence Secretary, has said it's a more dangerous world, yet the government prioritised tax cuts and childcare over defence. That just doesn't feel quite right in today's atmosphere.
And Chris, we saw yesterday the government officially blaming China for that data hack. But what if China or Russia, any of our, potential enemies, were to actually not just go about data mining here in the UK, but enforce a malicious attack on the United Kingdom? Do we have the correct cyber infrastructure in order to be able to defend ourselves against such an attack?
Well, it depends who you mean by us, Rosie, really, whether you mean the military or indeed the civilian infrastructure. The fact of life is any country, any body with a large number of trained geeks can take on any country, to tell you the truth, and collapse its infrastructure. I mean, one of the things I've been looking at recently is our space infrastructure, the United States and ours. It's wide open to cyber attack, and we've been very complacent. What really worries me about all this is that I just get the impression politicians get worried about all these things just before an election. People like Sean and I have been saying this for 10 years. You've been hearing me bang on about the threat from China, Russia and Iran. And now suddenly in an election year, it's important.
So it feels like electioneering, basically.
Well, this is the point, though, isn't it? That of course, and we know, don't we, that a stronger military and more spending will appeal to a Tory base. We know that. But I want to take your point about it's a strategic plan over 10 years, presumably, gentlemen, as military people. That's where the frustration of our political system comes in, because you'll get 5 years and a change, presumably, and 5 years and a change. Presumably, it's a bit like the NHS. There needs to cut cross-party involvement to make sure that something happens across a sustained period of time. Would you agree with that, Sean?
Well, I'm very proud of our democracy. Chris and I served, and we watched a lot of colleagues give up their lives to preserve our democracy. It has its weaknesses. I think Churchill famously described it as the least worst option of governing. One of the challenges, though, as highlighted at the moment, is that the government has actually recognised that there's an increasing threat, more money should be spent, but it's not going to have a defence review until the general election. And of course, whoever gets in afterwards, they're going to have a defence review, and in time. But the results of that won't be for about a year after that. So we've got 2 years where we're going to be muddling on at a time when it feels that Russia is feeling emboldened. It's looking like it's pushing back Ukraine. China will learn its own lessons from what's going on. And it doesn't feel the time where we can be treading water. It feels like the time where we should be pushing ahead. And that is a worry about one of the weaknesses of our political system.
And Sean, do you think things will be different under Labour?
Well, I try to avoid getting involved in politics in these sorts of conversations. I've been engaging with quite a lot of cross-party folks to do some influencing around the piece, and I think they're just as concerned as anybody as to the concerns of the future. But the harsh reality was it vision without funding is hallucination, and unless you've got money, it's very difficult to spend it on. If you spend more on defence, where do you take it from? And that, unfortunately, is a line that any government is going to struggle with over the next few years.
It's interesting, just to finish as well, Chris, and both of you, so grateful to have you on. I just feel like there is an acknowledgement now, whether it's the cybersecurity nonsense yesterday, and that was 3 years, by the way, or we look at the Middle East, or we look at Ukraine. I used to be called, you're warmongering. I don't think we are accused of that now, because I think the world, briefly, is in a far more volatile place, and that's why people will call for greater investment and a change. Would you agree with that briefly, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, Jeremy, look, we're in 1937 at the moment. Our politicians then, after a decade of appeasement, suddenly realised something was up, and we started rearming again. And Sean's right, we've got to start saying to our politicians, what outcomes do you want? Because that's not what they're saying at the moment. Everybody says, let's have a bigger army, but nobody can tell you why we need a bigger army. It's lessons like that have to be dealt with. But the fact of life is, as we've seen with our European allies, I mean, Germany, with its huge GDP, spends barely more than 1.3%.
I cut you off there. I hate to cut you both off because you are my favourite guest. Sean Bell, former NATO commander Chris Parry, thank you very, very much indeed.